All right, welcome to the introductory video to the Revelation Core Series. Excited to be here and doing this video. One quick note for those who might come to this video and recognize it's the second video. There's actually a version 2 that I'm doing relative to the first video that I put out for this particular video. And it's because I have a different understanding now, I think a better perspective on the structure of Revelation. All of the interpretive keys are the same. Nothing substantial has changed other than just the way I view the organization of the book. So not super critical to any of the interpretations or the theological framework or kind of the interpretation that we're building on from Daniel. But a different table that I'll show in this video now, and a different table in the main document, which I definitely recommend going and downloading that document, looking at it, because I have an abbreviated version of that table here for the video. Just because of space on the slide, it's hard to cram the whole table into one spot. But I think that table is much better than the previous one, so I thought it was worth just re-recording this video so I can fully explain that table and have that match to the document instead of the older table that I had that had a different perspective on the structure that I think was less complete. As I went through the other videos and made them, kind of a few extra things crystallized that helped me see the structure in a different way, and I think a fuller light, in a way that I think will help you understand the book, or as you go through, to not be lost, and kind of think about what is the sequence of events, where do things fit in the big picture. So I think it's a much better big picture view, and hence worth making the update, because I think it'll help you navigate the entire book as a whole as you go through it. Or if you're in the middle of it and you forget where am I in the grand scheme, zoom out, look at that table. That table I think is going to be super helpful for you, as it is for me. So I think it's really a helpful guide. So that's one thing. The second thing is, if you're coming here and you haven't seen the Daniel videos or read the Daniel document, I highly recommend you do that. We're covering Revelation, but the understanding and the interpretation of the key passages from Revelation is heavily built on our understanding from Daniel, and specifically the 70th seven. So have a document and videos on that. And kind of that was the impetus really to come to Revelation in the first place, was uncovering or understanding the 70th seven, and realizing that those numbers are present in Revelation in a significant way, as are lots of other references to Daniel. Made sense to come and do that, use that key. And it definitely unlocks some critical pieces in Revelation that have been locked down, I would say, kind of a tight bank vault, if you will. And the Daniel 3.5 key, the number key from Daniel, definitely unlocks that. So I will not be explaining all of those details or in terms of the background or where that comes from. So if you don't go back and watch that or not familiar with it, you'll be a little bit lost at some points in the Revelation series here, because there'll be a number of times where we're going to use the Daniel numbers without the full justification of where that comes from or why we do that. So you might think, oh, that's a wild assumption. On what grounds are you doing that? Well, a lot of ground, very well supported, well-grounded reasons for doing that, but not going to unpack all those in the Revelation series. So with that, let us dive in. So I'm calling it Revelation Daniel Unsealed because of the strong link to Daniel. So it's a framework that's going to be a unified interpretation of both Daniel and Revelation, and you'll see how the Daniel numbers help establish that relationship and sort of clarify a lot of things, and it makes a lot of sense. Why do we say Daniel unsealed? Because Daniel was told to seal up the words of the scroll until the time of the end. The point we made in the Daniel videos and document is that that's not the time of the end of the universe. That's not the consummation of all things, the judgment of the living and the dead. That is the end of the Old Covenant. The time of the end is the end of the Old Covenant that Daniel was living under when those visions were given to him, when he was sitting in Babylonian exile. Correspondingly, Revelation says, do not seal up the words of the prophecy because the time is near. What was the time that's near? Not the end of the world, the physical universe, or the consummation of all things, but the end of the Old Covenant. It was falling apart. As Hebrews tells us, it was already in process after the crucifixion and resurrection, but it wasn't totally dismantled. It wasn't totally gone until 70 AD, roughly. It was multiple things leading up to that, so I don't want to act like it all happened just in 70 AD, but the culmination or the sort of final stroke certainly would be 70 AD when the temple was burned, Jerusalem was totally destroyed, and the end of the Old Covenant was complete. So that process is what's happening during the second half of the 70th Revelation is largely about that, and so the time was near when Revelation was given to John. And so one was a sealing up, the other is an unsealing, because it is describing the same things that Daniel was about. Now we're going to see on fuller display in Revelation. So John is definitely writing the unsealing of Daniel's book, as you'll see as we go throughout the series. There is a shared architecture. We'll just highlight briefly. There's plenty of other examples. These are just a few key ones. So the central figure, there's of course the anointed one of Daniel, particularly chapters 9 through 12. But you'll see it through all the other chapters. Go watch the Daniel video on the 5 visions. All of the 5 visions are about the same thing, and they are about Jesus and the 70th seven. Revelation is, of course, the Lamb. Shows up like 27 times. Some people talk about, he's coming back. The second advent will be the Lion of Judah. The Lion of Judah appears at the very beginning, and then he turns and he doesn't see a lion. He sees a lamb. And every other time in Revelation, he's represented as the Lamb. And I think it's like 27-ish. So definitely the key figure of Revelation is the Lamb, which was, again, not fully realized in Daniel, right? The whole, he'll be cut off and he will have nothing. And the abomination that causes desolation. There's all these allusions in Daniel or references, but he was not known as the Lamb who would be slain in Daniel. Now he's revealed in Revelation, the full unveiling of who Jesus is. He is the Lamb who was slain. Pivotal event is the same in both, Messiah being cut off, the Lamb being slaughtered. Time signature, again, we'll unpack this in great detail as we go through the various places where it shows up, but there's the time, times, and half a time. The 1290, the 1335 in Revelation, you have the same thing, the 1260 and the 42 months. That's the time times and half. That's the strict sort of time times and a half or 3.5 section. So you have that multiple places in Revelation because it's covering the same time period that Daniel was talking about. Temple focus, so there's a desolation of the sanctuary, the destruction of Jerusalem. We're going to see similar things in Revelation that are being displayed in vision form as well. Flood imagery, so Daniel said the end will come like a flood. We had the date that links to Noah's flood is the 1335 number. In Revelation, we literally see a dragon spewing a flood, and it is to overtake the woman and her children. So we'll get into all of that in chapter 12, but definitely a lot of similar imagery that is shared between the two books. The seal, again, being opened. So Daniel is told to seal up the scroll, but then in Revelation, the whole thing kicks off with a throne room scene in heaven where a scroll is being unsealed by the Lamb. And that's what kicks off all of the ensuing events, both the judgments, but also the other things that are not judgment related, which we'll get to. It is twofold. The whole point is not judgment. That's only one half of the equation. Okay, and then blessedness, there's some similar, blessed is the one who keeps or who waits or who reads the book or whatever. Again, a lot of similarities. And then the end of the old order is one of the big points. Again, the end of the age is Daniel prophesying. The angels are inquiring, when will these astonishing things happen? When will the end of this age be? And that involves the temple destruction, the ending of sacrifice, all of that stuff that took place when the old covenant was brought to an end. And then in Revelation, we see it in great detail and at length with Babylon falling and New Jerusalem coming. So the point, one of the main thrusts of Revelation is not just judgment. It is judgment on the old, but it is also the birth of the new. They go together. They're side by side. They're flip sides of the same coin. All right. So there's two tellings of the same story. Daniel gives us the arithmetic in the sense of the timetables, the roadmap, and then some of the time markers of the 77. So we sort of know what period are we dealing with. Revelation plays out the drama, shows us more players than Daniel gives us insight into. There's some allusions to the horn and different things in some of Daniel's visions, but then Revelation's going to have a lot of those players fleshed out in much greater detail. Which is helpful to see who they are exactly and to remove all doubt, as well as to see more detail about the events that were in play during the 70th seven. So in a sense, it's one prophet in exile looking forward, which is Daniel, and then John is looking at his present moment exiled on Patmos. We'll talk about the timing of when he wrote this, or when the vision came. I think it's very, very clear from Revelation. You could call it internal evidence. There's both internal evidence and external evidence that we look at when deciding when a book of the Bible was authored or who authored it. I think the internal evidence is very, very strong, and quite frankly is convincing on when he wrote it. So anyway, when he writes it, it's certainly, everybody agrees it's somewhere around, between 60 and 100 AD. So the details are more where within that window. But obviously, John wrote it during his lifetime, and whereas Daniel was looking forward, John is, living during the unfolding of these things just after the cross and somewhere around the time of the destruction of the temple and the Old Covenant. So what is the scope of what we're going to cover here? We're not going to cover every single phrase, every little phrase or image, but we're looking mainly at big picture architecture, the who, the what, the when, what is the big story that's being told, what are some of the anchoring time markers that Daniel's going to provide. So your interpretation is going to have to fit within those time frames, and that's going to be have significant ramifications, as you'll see. Certain common popular eschatological viewpoints or perspectives in our day are frankly not going to survive because they don't fit within the time frame. And Daniel's numbers and the 70th 7 understanding is going to lock down the time frame very, very tightly. Now, you might say, well, that's a bold claim, and it is, but it was a bold claim to offer an explanation of the 70th 7 in the first place. What you'll see is it's more than just a claim. There's going to be some proof to that claim in the form of Daniel's numbers unlocking visions that previously were totally locked up, and everybody's guessing about it. I'm going to make the claim, and again, I know it's bold, but when you get to the videos or if you've already read the document, you'll know it's pretty convincing about several of the key visions there, particularly the most difficult ones are going to just fall perfectly in line and be very validated by other scripture. It becomes very clear, even quantitatively clear, about what those visions are about. So I think that lends further proof, not just to the 77, quantitatively itself in terms of the dates and all that and the alignment, but what we then do with that also when that works. In other words, when you open a door, you don't have to argue about the key anymore, and whether it's the right key or how you made the key or if the key is valid, right? If you want to argue about that, you can, but when someone takes that key and they go and they unlock a door and it just opens that was previously totally locked and nobody had the key, that becomes a compelling proof that the key is in fact the right key, right? And at some point you can stop debating the key and how it was made because you can see that it works. All right, so we are going to cover details. We're not going to decode every symbolic detail. Maybe they all have meaning, maybe they don't. Certainly God is a God of details, and so I wouldn't be surprised if everything has meaning. I also will say some of the key, not key, but recurring language around some of the judgments, like lightning and flashes of lightning and sounds of thunder pealing and things like that are, I think, not literal and not even symbolic of actual events. I think a lot of it is symbolic of real, people or players or events or systems like the Old Covenant, the New Covenant. But I think some of that language is definitely just common apocalyptic type language for the genre of writing that Revelation is, and is just meant to, imply and highlight that God is in play. He's doing significant cosmic things, and that's what's unfolding. Not so much that every little detail, every bolt of lightning has to have some, symbolic meaning to something that actually happened in history or, whatever. So I don't think every detail has a direct meaning. Some of them are just a collection of phrases that mean something, but certainly we're going to see a lot of them do have a lot of meaning or very specific mappings to real people or real events. Apocalyptic imagery is layered. Sometimes there's multiple resonances, so it's not always that even it means one thing. We'll see in the two witnesses vision that there's multiple things alluded to from the Old Testament that then sort of find their fulfillment in one image or one player in Revelation, but there's sort of multiple resonances, multiple streams that are feeding into that. What is the test of a framework? So again, in terms of scope, what are we trying to do? We're looking for something that is structurally grounded, meaning it makes sense of, that's why I wanted to redo this video, because I think the structural perspective on Revelation is important. It actually fits very nicely. It's not proof of the framework that I'm talking about here, but it certainly fits, and it helps. Again, I think the framework brings clarity to the structure of Revelation that is otherwise, a lot of people look at it different ways and try to figure out what goes with what. And I think some of that is good and valuable, and some of it that I've come across is frankly seems to not even work. You have to sort of squint one eye and merge three things together in order to get a set of seven where there isn't a seven. There's certainly plenty of sevens, but it's not like everything fits an exact set of seven. So I think sometimes the structural perspectives have gone too far in trying to view structure where there isn't any. So I think it's important for a framework to kind of have something to say, make some statement about the structure of the book. It has to be historically coherent, particularly if it leans in a preterist direction, which this is. It's got to make sense of history. So if it predicts it's supposed to be about a particular time in history, then it better fit with what we know about that particular time in history. Otherwise, that's a weakness of the framework. It's got to be theologically consistent. So as a Bible-believing Christian, I'm not interested in secular perspectives that, treat Scripture as not inspired. So not going to go down any of those paths. Ergo, any interpretation needs to fit with the rest of Scripture and needs to be theologically consistent. And I think what you'll find here as we go through the book of Revelation is that this framework is remarkably theologically consistent. It glorifies Jesus. It puts him in his right place. It also has a lot to say about, because it will show that Revelation has a lot to say about the church, which is what God is doing right now on the earth. He's working through the new covenant, which is with those who are in Christ. And so much of Revelation actually is about that I think we have missed historically. Won't give any spoilers away, but you're going to see the church represented in some ways that we sort of vaguely knew, but we're going to link it to other parts of Scripture that's going to be very compelling. That has to do with the church, and specifically the early launching of the church in the first century. We'll try to note where we're confident, where there's some uncertainty or latitude, and where I think there's not latitude because, for example, Daniel's dates locks you in. Other places that rigidity isn't there, and so try to point that out. Okay. So what I want to do is go through the keys. I think there's 7 of them. And these are key interpretive points that you should know before you embark on Revelation. Obviously, it's also fair to read it with a blank slate, and then, so I don't want to color your interpretation or your perspective on it in that sense. But once it's been read, we can see that these things are there, and I think for future readings, it's helpful to have these things in mind. Particularly, a few of them are really relevant for us as modern, and in my case, Western Christians in the church, that there's some keys that are not natural or intuitive to us, and I think that has caused a lot of confusion about Revelation, and so we'll try to get some of that in the front of your mind so that as you're reading it, you'll be more attuned to recognizing when you run across one of those things and don't make the common mistake of interpreting it the wrong way. Understand what it's supposed, what it really is about and what it needs to say to us in Revelation's context, because some of it is foreign to us. All right, so key number 1, the time signatures are Daniel's. I mentioned that 42 months, 1260 days, times and a half. This one's a new one, the 3.5 days in Revelation 11. Not going to ruin any spoilers. You can watch those videos. There's 4 of them because it's a key vision to unpack, and there's a lot of detail to it. And so that one, so I won't mention what that one's about, but just know that 3.5 days, which is not exactly, Daniel's always measured in 3.5 year chunks, but those are 3.5 days. So that one's interesting. The 77 conversion, if you recall, is basically a times 10 multiplier. That's not an arbitrary number. That's just what becomes the convenient, simplest way to think about. When you see a number in Revelation that is a 70th 7 number, not all numbers in Revelation are 70th 7 numbers, but if it is a 70th 7 number, then this conversion applies every single time. Again, this is not hand-wavy, if we do it on this one, but then not these others. No, every 70th 7 number, you're going to do this, and it's going to work. So it's times 10. So the 1260 days is 3.5 years, but it becomes 35 years. About 34.5 years in our calendar time, because the ancient Near East administrative calendar that's in play is a 360-day year calendar. So you got to shave some days when you do it that way. So it comes out to about 34.5 real, solar 365-day years. These are imports from Daniel. So we didn't invent these in Revelation. We're not making this up. We're saying, from Daniel, we know that this is true. We come to Revelation, we simply apply it. a priori up front, and then it turns out it works really, really well. Some of them are shared duration, which means parallel, not sequential. Again, we'll see. That's where Daniel's time signatures really help, because not only some of them, like the 3.5 days, it unlocks the actual vision for us in an amazing way, but the ones that are the 42 months, the 1260 days, different ways to refer to the 35-year period. So sometimes it's describing the same thing, which again helps lock down the interpretation of Revelation and where we put some of these visions and what they mean, but where they fit chronologically, because we know it's talking about the 70th seven when it's using those numbers, and we know what the 70th seven is. Okay, key number 2, recapitulation. Okay, this is one of the key changes, though, from my previous video and earlier versions of the document, is that there is recapitulation. I originally had that as sort of a pure thing, though, just recapitulation. What does recapitulation mean? It means you sort of go through, from A to Z, and then you start back over. The next one is actually A to Z again. It's not after Z. It's not AA, if you're in the spreadsheet world. It's not a new sequence that follows after that one. You're going back to the beginning. So you're retelling the same thing from multiple vantage points over and over. And so I originally viewed it that way. A lot of people do describe that's not a new idea that I'm bringing here. But so plenty of people see the recapitulation happening and some of the parallel, things that seem to be parallel. It goes through once, it comes back, and it goes through again. And you can link some of those things up. That's how you can sort of identify the parallel nature of it. And that's true. I would have said Revelation is not chronological. But as I dug even deeper, putting together some of the later videos, later chapter videos, I sort of realized more and more like, wait a minute, there is actually a little bit of chronology to it. It's not strictly chronological because recapitulation is happening, but there also is some forward movement. And that's the reason for rebuilding the structural table, which we'll get to in a minute. Is that I think that's a helpful way to see it. Because again, some people, I think that's part of the confusion again of Revelation, is both of those are true. So there's some people that point to things and say, look, it's recapitulating, it's parallel, telling of the same thing again, just from a different angle. That's true. Other people are saying, yeah, but there's progression, there's the 1/4 and then 1/3 and then full. And so there is this forward progression as well. And so I think turns out, which is sometimes nice, hey, guys, everyone's right. Both sides are right. Or have part of the truth. I don't think either one is fully by itself the only thing. It is actually both. It is recapitulation. There is a parallel dimension to it, but it's also forward moving at the same time. And so I'll go over what that is. So, for example, recapitulation, the seals build to a climax, but then the trumpets start over. They sort of start to cover the same period. The trumpets build, but then the woman and the dragon in chapters 12 and 13 starts over and even goes all the way back to the birth of Jesus. So each tells the same story from a different vantage point, and that's useful to know. The seals represent the covenant enacted, kind of the starting point of the second half of the 70th seven, which is the cross, and sort of putting that in place, authorizing a sort of a judicial effect or perspective, which makes sense, right? Because it's seals. Trumpets is the kingdom proclaimed. Trumpets involve announcing something, whether that's something good or bad is dependent on the context, but trumpets are there to get people's attention and make something known. The woman and the dragon is the cosmic war, which multiple of Daniel's visions are about. Chapter 11 or 10 in particular says, the angel told him, I've come to tell you about a great war that will happen in the future or at the time of the end. And there's the struggle and power struggle of the horns in the earlier chapters like 7 and 8. So definitely cosmic war from Daniel talks about. Revelation is going to show that again in greater detail with greater explanations of the people or unveiling of the players, as well as the details of the actions or the events that are transpiring during that war. The bowls are the old order eliminated, which is the final and utter desolation. Remember, Daniel says desolations are decreed. So the utter desolation of the old order. So the parallel, yes, there's parallel, but it's not static. The whole thing moves forward. And again, seals, trumpets, bowls is one way to see it. We'll see some other pieces as well, but just in those advancing, and we mentioned those because there are the sevens. So there's 7 seals, there's 7 trumpets, and there's 7 bowls. Okay, so one simple way to think about this recapitulation with a forward arc is there's the cross, that's the beginning of the 70th seven. There's a proclamation period. That's the early church and the new covenant people proclaiming on the earth the new covenant and the eternal gospel, which we'll read about in chapter 15, I think, 16. And then there's a harvest. So there's a dual harvest that collects the good and the bad. The grapes goes into the wrath. The wrath is the bowls that gets poured out. And then in the end, the king is reigning. So chapter 19, we see the rider riding out with his people behind him, and they have victory over the beast and the false prophet and the dragon and all of that stuff. And so there is definitely that progression from chapter 4 to chapter 19. There is sort of a focus on the cross and what it inaugurates and what it authorizes in heaven's throne room or heaven's court. And then that gets proclaimed. The harvest is happening, but all along the way, there's also the judgment. That's the recapitulation, sort of like the multiple cycles. All of them have judgment going alongside. It's not like all the judgment happens at the very end. There's judgment that's being sort of portrayed through each of the parallel cycles, while the parallel cycles themselves are moving the story forward. Again, from seals being the cross, proclamation being trumpets, wrath being bowls, and then the final after the wrath, we see a full detail post-mortem, if you will, on Babylon, which is the Old Covenant, which is Jerusalem, and then the king riding out. The bride has made herself ready. So, the bride's not ready at the very beginning in the seals. That she's purchased. So that's why I say it is a forward movement, even though some of the elements are there the whole time. And that definitely has caused some of the confusion, I think, around properly interpreting the book, and why I think some of these keys are helpful to a proper understanding of it, and particularly the structural update that I'm making here with the table that we'll cover in a second helps further lay this out. And I think it helps avoid some of the confusing aspects of Revelation, because it is both. It's doing recapitulation, but it's also driving forward, so there is sort of a chronology happening. And then beyond the king reigning is the millennium. The millennium is not talked about anywhere in the Bible, by the way, except Revelation chapter 20. And so that's not talked about in chapter 4 or 5. And so it's not in play when the cross is being discussed and laid. So there is a progression from cross all the way to millennium that's happening, even while there's some parallel recapitulation happening along the way. Okay. Structural grammar. So key number 3, what is the actual structure? So beyond the recapitulation, let's look at a table here that shows us the overall, high-level view of the book itself and understand how the parts fit together. So in the document, the Revelation document is available on the website, free download. Please go download it. I have that table has more detail. This is a condensed version of that table, so highly recommend if you're interested in the structure of Revelation, for sure go get the document. I'll try to touch on most of the things here, but visually it's got more detail in the table and has all of the other elements represented, like the visions of the 144,000, the 2 witnesses, whereas here I'm going to collapse some of that into a single row just to be able to fit it all on one screen so we can see at the end what we have here. So again, chapters 4 and on, I'm not starting with chapters 1 through 3. I think that's sort of front matter. The letters to the churches are, I think, qualitatively different. So really just want to try to get the main visions, although no disrespect to the letters to the churches. That's a cool vision and very important as well. But we start in chapter 4 with the seals of the covenant. So the throne room in heaven, I consider the start of this. They're related to the seals because it rolls right into the seals. The Lamb gets the scroll. The scroll has the seals. He starts to undo the seals and open the seals because he's the only one worthy who's been found to be able to do that. And then things start to unfold with the seals. So I consider all of chapter 4 through the first couple verses of 8 is all seals material. And it's the cross ratifying the contract. So again, we think, what does a seal usually mean in this context, or any context really? It means, or in the context of a scroll, it means, here's a legal document, and the contents are protected. Who's allowed to open it in the sense of like a will? The Bible talks about that. Someone dies. In this case, Jesus did die. That's one of the things that authorized him to be able to open it. He was died and risen. But the point being that it involves judicial flavor type of stuff. The covenant is ratified. It is both, and it's a 2-sided scroll, okay, which is another indicator that there's always going to be 2 things going on in the rest of these visions, which is the inauguration of the new is authorized. He purchased a people for himself. That is talked about in these chapters. and its judgment on the old. That be the final act of rebellion was the crucifixion. When the Jews, when Old Covenant Israel and the leadership of Jerusalem and the Sanhedrin crucified Jesus, that was the final straw. Now, as we know from the rest of the New Testament, they still could repent after that. So when I say final straw, it was sort of as a system, as an institution, the Old Covenant, from God's perspective, was done. And judgment was pronounced. And again, what authorized or justified that? The cross. So that's why the cross is central, because the cross is what authorized not only the purchase of the new, but the destruction of the old, right? The abomination that causes desolation. So the desolation was decreed in the Old Covenant, right? Deuteronomy, go look up Deuteronomy. All of those curses and all the stuff you're going to see unfold in Revelation, much of it takes the language directly out of Deuteronomy, the covenant curses. If you don't obey the law that was given, then here's all the terrible things that are going to happen. Then those things are listed in Revelation. Those things are brought. Okay, so the seals of the covenant flavor is kicking things off. Okay, what does heaven say? What gets authorized in heaven? Daniel, if you recall, also had a courtroom scene. And Revelation kicks off with a courtroom scene before any of the big crazy stuff starts happening. Then chapters 8 through 11 are the trumpets. I'm calling them trumpets of proclamation because trumpets proclaim. And again, it's helping us realize when you think, oh, there's 7 seals, there's 7 trumpets, there's 7 bowls. What are they? Well, let's add a little phrase here to help us. Seals are covenant related, right? Document, judicial. Trumpets are about proclaiming something. What are we proclaiming? Twofold thing: judgment and the birth of the new. Okay, the gospel, the good news, the good side of the two-sided coin. And so, oh, by the way, there is a final verse that sort of sums up each of these for the seals. It's 8:1 is sort of where it ends. The trumpets and the bowls give a more clear statement, I feel like. That's sort of a summary, like a postscript, like, okay, all this stuff, and then here's kind of the summary statement that sort of wraps the whole thing up. And so I think that's where we kind of see that helps us clarify, oh, what at the end of the trumpets is a proclamation that the kingdom is here. The kingdom is proclaimed. The king has begun to reign with his people. That's a key part of the trumpets of proclamation, is who's doing the proclaiming, who's doing the trumpeting. And it starts in heaven. There are angels that do that. But then we see, and that's where some of the things that are considered interludes, are not interludes at all. They are the climax of the different sections. So far from being an interlude, the little scroll and the 2 witnesses are the climax of the trumpets of proclamation section before it ends, and then the next piece comes. Okay, then there is a not numbered sequence, which is fine. Revelation never says every vision we're going to see is going to be a numbered sequence. There are 3 numbered sequences. Doesn't mean they all have to be, and they're not. So once we get past trumpets, we get some non-numbered events, which are the war and harvest represented. So chapter 12 is the woman and the dragon. Chapter 13 is the 2 beasts and the dragon. And then chapter 14 is a harvest where the grain is kept and the grapes are put into the winepress of the wrath of God's fury. And then that leads immediately into the bowls of wrath. So the harvest feeds into the bowls of wrath, which again is why I say there is some forward movement. There's a little bit of chronological sort of, movement is the best word, even though it's not strictly, every section doesn't immediately follow chronologically because, again, some of it's recapitulation. So the bowls of wrath are there, and it's the wrath, it's the immediately following the grapes put in from the harvest into the winepress of God's wrath, and then the angels, the bowl angels show up, and they start dishing out the bowls of wrath. And then the final culminating statement there is chapter 16, verse 17. It is done. And that is not Jesus saying it is finished on the cross. It is saying that the final judgment, it even says that in the very beginning, the 7 bowls are the 7 final judgments, last judgments, last because with them the wrath of God is completed and the old covenant is totally eradicated. So that's happening. So that, again, chronologically, that didn't happen right after the resurrection. That in its final form happens at 70 AD. But certainly a lot of judgment leading up to that. It's not like everything just went bad on the day the temple was burned, but the day that before everything was great. No, it was unraveling for years leading up to that. So that wrath is being poured out over the 70th second half. It doesn't have to be right there at the end. It doesn't even have to be the last 3.5 years leading up to AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, because again, the 3.5 is not 3.5 years, and it's not 7 years. It's the 70th 7, and it's 35 years. And so from the cross all the way to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD can be and is the judgment period where those judgments are being poured out. Okay. Next line is Babylon, which is Jerusalem. We'll get to that in a minute. But Babylon gets destroyed. That is, it sort of looks gray here, I think, on my screen, but it's supposed to be kind of bluish because it's related to the bowls of wrath. It's not really totally separate. The reason I say that is the seventh angel, the seventh bowl angel, is the one who comes forward and says, hey, I'll explain this to you and show you this other vision. And so that vision of Babylon being destroyed, the harlot riding the beast, is very much connected to the 7 bowls, which is the wrath. So those go together, although it's not a numbered sequence. It finishes after the 7 bowls, and then we get sort of a further unpacking of what those bowls and that judgment represented and who it's poured out on. It's poured out on the harlot city, Jerusalem, also called Babylon in Revelation. Then we have the 70th 7 finale, which is the bride is made ready in chapter 19, and she, of course, contrasts with the harlot wife, former wife that's being destroyed, who was unfaithful. So there's the unfaithful woman, and then or city, and then there's the faithful bride. And then the latter part of chapter 19 is the king riding out. Everyone's familiar with that passage, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He rides out, and he's also got his people with him. He has a sword coming out of his mouth, which is the word of God. And so that's Jesus, of course, the rider, and he's riding out with his bride. So the 77 finale is Jesus riding out and beating the enemies that were there. And so the old is finally done. The new is there. It's very much a new Exodus. So you'll see the song of Moses and of the Lamb in this, actually not in 19, I think that's 18, sorry. Or maybe the bowls of wrath, I think it's 16. But anyway, so the picture at the very end is very much a new Exodus, the song of Moses and of the Lamb. So the same way that the nation of Israel came out of Egypt and God was destroying Egypt with plagues and judgment, and in Egypt even tried to lash out and get the nation as they had already left, and then Pharaoh changes his mind, they charge after them. Very much strong parallels to what you see in Revelation. The dragon, the woman births the son, he's protected by God. The dragon goes off to make war against the rest of her people, her children, which are those who, it says, hold to the testimony of Jesus. So that is the church. So the devil is trying to swallow them up even as they're being brought out. And in 17:18, when Babylon is talks about, come out from them, my people, come out from her, come out from Babylon, and be separate. So there's very much an Exodus vibe, which is fitting for the new covenant being an exodus from the old, in the same way that the old sort of exited from Egypt. Okay, so he rides out. That's the end of the 77. So then what comes after that? Oh, then we're at chapter 20, and we hear this new concept called the millennium, which is the church age. Okay, Christ is reigning with his saints. We'll justify that more fully later. I got to keep going here. This is just interpretive keys. So I'm not justifying fully some of these concepts, but this is what we'll lay out as we go through the video. So again, the millennium wasn't relevant or wasn't in play when the seals were happening, up at the top. So we've got definitely a progression in terms of cross, trumpets of proclamation. You're going to see some stuff about Acts in there, the early church, and the cosmic drama, though, because then that wasn't the end, right? In Acts, then there's the persecution that comes, and both from the Jews, but then also from Rome under Nero. So as the 77 second half is unfolding, this war is happening. The dragon is trying to still, before the church can really grow and pop out of Israel, right, in Jerusalem, and go into the nations, he's trying to squash it right there at the source. And so there's persecution first from Israel, and then there's persecution from Rome. And so God has not destroyed, so the bowls of wrath haven't really come, right? Babylon hasn't been destroyed. So that is happening. All these things are happening at the same time in the 70th 7. It's such a dynamic time, covenantally speaking. But then once it's all done, and the old is laid to rest, she's thrown into the sea like a big boulder. It says there's an angel who takes a big millstone, throws it in the sea, and says, Babylon's thrown down, never to rise again. The church has survived that. She's been brought out of the tribulation period and the persecution and the suffering, and spared from the judgment. So you'll see this common theme is that there's the preservation of that remnant while the old is being destroyed, the new is being brought out of that and protected. But then you arrive at the millennium, and so that's the first time that gets introduced. So that will be the church age, and then at the very end of that, which is a long time, 1,000 years, not specific 1,000 literal years, but symbolic of a very long time, then the consummation comes, and that's chapters 20, the later part of chapter 20, and then 21 and 22 is all of that stuff. So that is your structural guide to Revelation. You can break it up in those sections. I feel like it's a very natural breaking up. I'm not trying to force some kind of sevens. Actually, I make 3, 4, 3, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. And then there's the letters to the churches. So there's there's not 7 sections to Revelation. If we're trying to do that, we're trying to force something that's not there. There are multiple sets of 7. There's 7 seals. There's 7 trumpets. There's 7 bowls. But that doesn't mean the whole thing can be broken up into into groups of 7. I feel like usually where I've seen that, at least what I've seen, is it's kind of being forced. So here I'm not trying to force some numerical breakdown. I'm trying to just zoom out and go, how do these things fit? And yeah, there's parallel. That was the first sort of perspective I'd presented in the original video for this. And there was a table kind of helping you look at the remnant versus the harlot, and Old Covenant versus New in each of the visions. But I feel like really this is a better perspective on what the different pieces are and how, there's recapitulation inside these different rows, but there is sort of a progression of the rows themselves from across the 70th 7 and then beyond the 70th 7 in terms of the millennium and the consummation of all things. Okay, a couple of summary points. Think about the series or the sequences of 7. What they mean. The term seal has to do with the covenant, okay? That's cross-related. Trumpets are proclaiming things. That's the kingdom getting announced that was inaugurated and authorized by Jesus at the cross, but it has to unfold, has to come out of someone's mouth, has to get proclaimed. And the reality that is part of what the trumpets are about is that the way God chose to do that was not to have Jesus stick around and proclaim the kingdom. He proclaimed it during his life and his ministry. And then he was crucified and resurrected, and then he left behind his people to do that. So we are the ones proclaiming the kingdom, and we see that happen in Revelation. So that gets off the ground and gets up and running. Bowl is, poured out. And there's Old Testament examples of that, plenty of them, like a bowl of wrath, right? Fill up all of your sins, and that turns into a bowl of wrath that gets poured out back on you because you brought it upon yourself. So bowls definitely involve judgment and wrath. So in order, again, kind of a rough sequence, covenant gets ratified, the kingdom is getting established and built. That's, you see in the trumpets, that's what it's about. It's not just judgment. Yeah, there's some judgment trumpets, but not everything that happens in the trumpet section is judgment on the old. It's also about the new getting established. The kingdom that was the rock in Daniel chapter 2 that destroyed the statue, and then it grew to a mountain that took over the whole earth, right? So this kingdom that lasts forever is being established, but it was authorized at the resurrection. We might say, well, it was there from day one. Okay, sort of, but we're going to unpack how it wasn't exactly there from day one. On day one after the resurrection, there wasn't New Testament scriptures. There wasn't apostles and prophets and teachers of Ephesians 4. So there's a lot of things that Jesus was setting about putting in place to build the new during that 35-year period while starting to dismantle and destroy the old before it's sort of done. So it's a transitional period where the new is getting built. It's already authorized at the cross, yes, but it has to be built. It has to unfold in actual human history, and that takes a little time. Similarly, the judgment was pronounced in a sense at the cross, but then it had to take 35 years to totally get dismantled and Rome to come destroy everything. So that 35-year period is where the new is being built and birthed and the old is being destroyed. Afterwards, the old is totally gone. The Exodus has happened. Now the new covenant people move forward in history with the king reigning with him. Judgment by stages. So the first group is a fourth. There's a few references to a fourth. And then there's in the trumpets is references to a third, which is bigger than a fourth for those who are bad at fractions. And then the final is the bowls, and it says this is complete. With these, the wrath of God is complete. So it's full. There's no holding back. There's no restraint. There's no fractions. It's complete. So there is a sequence. Again, there's a progression in that sense. Not calendar related, because they recapitulate the entire 70th 7 in some ways. So I don't think that is a strictly calendrical kind of progression. It's more just in the apocalyptic nature of those judgment statements or visions or images. Still one story the whole time. It's the cross and the people that get birthed out of it, and the destruction of the old that was the outer shell around the new. The new gets birthed and it pops out of the old, and the old has to fall away and decay. This is the new wineskins. This is the seed example. A seed has to die sort of and have the shell, but then it pops out of it. So a lot of other scriptural references and analogies to this reality that is what is Revelation is talking about. It's the 70th seven, second half, and crossed at the beginning, judgment complete by the end, and the full launch of the new by the end of that time period. All right, key number 4, 2 Israels. Okay, very, very important. There is the bride, and so we have to think about, if we read the term Israel or somebody or an image that seems to represent Israel, we need to think about which one we're talking about. Why? Because there's 2. And in Revelation is part of the major point of Revelation, again, is that duality where there is the ending of the old and the inauguration of the new. And so both are called Israel in different contexts, right? Different passages of Scripture, not just Revelation, but elsewhere in the New Testament. So we need to be thinking about which one we're talking about. Otherwise, we could have a very wrong interpretation, right? If we think it's the one and it's the other, we're going to get off down some very funky trails that we want to avoid. So chapter 12, we see a woman clothed with the sun. That's going to be the bride. Okay, I'm not going to unpack all these here. We'll do that when we get to those chapters. There's 144,000 sealed for protection. That is the remnant. Inner temple is measured and claimed in chapter 11. Again, preserving a remnant. The bride is made ready very explicitly in chapter 19. That's, of course, the bride. Romans taught us not all descended from Israel are Israel. Galatians, if you belong to Christ, you're Abraham's seed. So, okay, we got to really think about it when we start talking about Israel, Jerusalem, some of these terms, which one is which. Okay, Daniel mentioned everyone whose name is found written in the Lamb's, well, he didn't say Lamb's Book of Life, but that's what we know. We would, looking backwards, we can sort of see that. So everyone whose name is found written in the book is who's included. In contrast, the harlot is Babylon, and we're going to make the case very convincingly. And this is not new. There's plenty of people who think this, but I kind of thought it was universal. I didn't realize that it's actually not that universal, but certainly not a new idea that we're presenting here for the first time. The outer court gets abandoned to the Gentiles. That is the Old Covenant, the great city where their Lord was crucified. That's Jerusalem. That city is very explicitly there in chapter 11 called Sodom and Egypt, and also basically Babylon. That's really interesting, again, because of the Exodus sort of motif that is present in Revelation in some very pronounced ways at certain points. Sodom was a city that was extremely corrupt and immoral, and what was their end? They were judged, and God brought fire and brimstone and destruction down on them and wiped the city off the face of the earth. So judgment on a very wicked city. Egypt was, of course, the nation that was enslaving the nation of Israel, and Israel came out of them in what we call the Exodus. It exited the premises, and Egypt even tried to lash out during those plagues, right, or after those plagues. The judgment was brought to them, and then they still tried to run after them to still bring them back, and so there was a final crushing blow dealt at the Red Sea, where all of Pharaoh and all of his key leaders were destroyed. So the Egypt analogy is definitely a powerful one, a poignant one. Babylon is, I think, largely can be thought of as the commercialization aspect. You'll see that in chapters 17 and 18. So she's the global city and just total worldliness, and love of money is not mentioned, but it sort of is implied in various places in chapter 17 and 18. So the comparison to Babylon and Egypt and Sodom have different perspectives on covenant unfaithfulness, which we see in the motif of harlot is Old Testament covenant unfaithfulness. Anytime you see a harlot or adultery, unfaithful, those things all are the same vibe of covenant unfaithfulness. It's not from foreign cities. It's not from foreign nations that you get that language for the most part in the Old Testament. So the harlot riding the beast in Revelation is, as we'll see, not Rome, but Jerusalem. In her was found the blood of prophets. That's from chapter 18. That echoes very strongly Jesus's statements in Matthew 23 about Jerusalem. He makes it very explicit there that it's about Jerusalem. In her is the blood of prophets. It's very clear where the blood of prophets resides. It's in Jerusalem. So in conclusion, the harlot is not Rome. The harlot is Jerusalem. So again, we got two different Israels going on in Revelation. We need to be paying attention to which one is which. Key 5 is, I think, probably the most challenging for us modern Western Christians. It is the coming on the clouds. You can look up some of these Old Testament passages. I think there's more in the document that I'm going to cover here if you want to really do a deep dive. But essentially, God coming doesn't always mean, and in fact, most of the time doesn't mean, when it involves judgment, doesn't mean him coming physically or appearing or manifesting himself physically. But he came to Egypt. He comes down when Assyria destroys Samaria. David's victory in Psalms, he talks about coming down. David was happy about that, but for his enemies, it's a coming down in judgment and destruction. Isaiah, again, from the ends of the heavens. So coming on the clouds is definitely the precedent set before we get to Revelation is that when we talk about God coming and coming on the clouds, it almost always means a judgment coming, and it doesn't mean a physical appearing or manifestation of God himself in the flesh or in some kind of even visible appearance like on Mount Sinai. It means that he's acting decisively, oftentimes through agents. Okay, we'll see in Revelation that's often through angels, but even their work is manifested in the earth by or in the form of earthly realities, such as an invading foreign nation. God sends in and says, "That's me coming. I came and I judged you." Well, he didn't show up and dish out judgment, verbally himself, but he links events that happen in human history on earth or links them with his coming in judgment. Okay, so that's one where when we hear coming on the clouds, that's not the second coming. It's going to be the coming in judgment on the old covenant. That's what Revelation is talking about. So it is not primarily a book about the second coming of Jesus. It is the coming in judgment on the old covenant, as he also is riding out victorious with the new covenant people that he has purchased. So the cloud represents what the scholars would call theophanic authority, not a physical vehicle. So it is a representation of God in his glory and with authority and with power. That's being represented when we say he's coming on a cloud or coming with the clouds. So we have to be careful when we read Revelation. We more naturally, I think, as Westerners, would think, oh, that's him coming. If he's coming, it means, hey, somebody came to my house. They showed up, right, in person, in the flesh. That is not what Revelation means necessarily, and so we have to pay attention to that. Going back to Daniel chapter 7, we can think about the direction of travel. The Son of Man there comes with the clouds of heaven. But where is he coming to? He is coming to heaven. He's approaching the Ancient of Days. The direction is to God, not from God to earth. So that again, and Daniel is related to Revelation. It's both the coming in terms of authority and the arrival of his kingdom with authority and power. And then it's also, again, linked to that, sort of not inseparable, is the coming in judgment. So it is sort of both in that sense. But in Daniel, he's given authority, glory, and sovereign power, and he that's when he comes to the Ancient of Days, when he comes to the throne room in heaven, coming with the clouds of heaven. So it's an enthronement. It's not a descent. It's not a coming of Jesus to the earth physically. It is the arrival of his reign, which is very much what Revelation is about. The arrival of his reign. And that involves the destruction of the old and the launch and empowerment of the new. So Revelation 1:7 is kind of the thesis statement for the whole book. It says, "Behold," after the intro for the first few verses, there's kind of some introductory material, John saying who he is and he had this vision and whatnot. But then, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds" is kind of a summary statement about what's going to unfold in the book. It's related to Daniel 7 enthronement language. But then it also says, "Even those who pierced him," which is a reference to Zechariah, and it anchors it to that generation, the generation that pierced him. This is another reason for interpreting a lot of Revelation as having first century connection and first century fulfillment, because of some of this language at the very beginning that kicks off the whole thing. "All the tribes of the land will mourn." the word land and the word for tribes generally is tribes of Israel. So there are actually, I believe, some translations, I think maybe older, that have all the tribes of Israel will mourn, because that is definitely a very fair and appropriate understanding or interpretation, is that when you're talking about tribes and the word land, that means the land of Israel, is the tribes of the land of Israel, the tribes of Israel. So specifically, they are being talked about as mourning. Why? Because that generation of the tribes of Israel, the land of Israel, is the generation that crucified Jesus. And remember, crucifixion is abomination that causes desolation. So it's a judgment coming. It's not a second coming in terms of the same way Jesus went up in the cloud. And the angel said, he's going to come again. I believe that, but that's not what this is about. These are references to a judgment coming that doesn't have to be, and I will argue is not, the same as the second coming of Jesus explicitly or physically. So the bodily second coming is real, but it doesn't come from Revelation. It comes from Acts, where the angel said, hey, the same way you just saw him go up in a cloud, he's going to come back that same way. Some people would still interpret that as the judgment coming in the cloud. But there's some other references you can also piece together. 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul talks about it. So I think there's other places. Revelation itself has, in chapter 20, has, I think, what we could call the second coming. It's the consummation of all things. But if you read it carefully, because again, if you think, no, Revelation has the second coming, Jesus on the white horse. No, that's Revelation 19, and that's not the same as Revelation 20. And so Revelation 20 doesn't have a rider. It doesn't have Jesus represented explicitly. It says basically there'll be the Gog and Magog, the four corners of the earth will gather together against and march against the camp of the Lord's people, but then fire will fall from heaven and consume them, and then the end comes. So there's very little detail there. It does not picture Jesus coming himself bodily, although I would say from other parts of Scripture, I think that is what is happening there. But you can't say that Revelation in chapter 20 pictures a bodily return of Jesus. It does not say that explicitly. And Revelation has proven prior to chapter 20 to be very capable of doing or providing a lot of explicit reference or pictures of Jesus doing things. And so to me, that absence is noteworthy there. But in any case, coming on the clouds doesn't have to mean the second coming. So the second coming does not equal coming in judgment. Those are two different things. And if we get them confused, we're going to be confused in our interpretation. We're also going to have trouble with our interpretation, because now this generation must mean something else than this generation. Also, all the phrases about near, this is going to happen soon, and the time is near and at hand, all of those things really lose a lot of their meaning, but they make sense if we understand coming on the clouds as a judgment coming and not the second coming. Then all of a sudden, all the things Jesus said can easily be fulfilled, and I will argue are fulfilled and were fulfilled in the first century during the second half, 70 to 7. That's when all of that stuff is being fulfilled. The judgment, the bowls of wrath, that's what was being alluded to and foreseen or prophetically seen at the time of Jesus, looking forward to the full destruction of the Old Covenant and the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Okay, so we don't want to conflate those. Most of Revelation is about the judgment coming, not the second coming. All right, key number 6, first century audience. With the Bible, everybody knows this. I think I've introduced the concept of a sophomore level Christian. So if you read the Bible once or have some experience and exposure to it, you're not brand new off the street, then you know that it aids your interpretation to think about who the book was written to. So if you're reading a book of the Bible, who was it first written to, and how would they have understood it and thought about it? That's a helpful hermeneutic. It's a helpful way of studying the Bible. It doesn't mean that there's not application for you, but it's true and right and good to acknowledge that it wasn't written to you. It wasn't written to us in our time. It was written to specific people in a specific time. And so understanding that is important. Very true for Revelation, because things like the time is near are there. And so, well, what time? What time is near? When was this written? It matters, right? Those who pierced him, a very specific generation during that first century. Those who crucified Jesus. We have time signatures that are Daniel 70-7 arithmetic that are also going to point to this first century audience and remind us that we're talking about the 70th second half. The number 666 is a number that they're told to calculate, and it seems implied that they're supposed to solve it. I think it says, it takes a mind of wisdom, but let him who has wisdom calculate it. So it's not presented as a mystery that can never be solved or will be solved in the distant future. It seems to be a statement that it implies that the readers or the original audience would be able to solve it. So knowing who that audience is relevant then in us being able to solve it and understand it. 7 hills, readers could name them. Those are the hills of Rome, very famous during that time. Revelation presupposes fluency in Daniel. There's a lot of connection to Daniel as well as Zechariah, Ezekiel. I mean, I think it's the most Old Testament linked book of the New Testament by far. I think it's hundreds of references if you piece them all together, whether it's phrases directly or images drawn from Old Testament prophecies. But Daniel is certainly one of either the top or the top 2. I think one time I heard it was second, maybe to Isaiah. So certainly strong linkages there that, again, first century audience would understand those things a lot better than us. And first century, primarily Jewish audience would understand very well. It becomes difficult for us because we're not as familiar with those things. So it helps us to think about that as we're trying to understand what it means. It was largely written to them. It was written to them. I would say it's largely about them, which we'll unpack as we go forward. So again, keeping in mind the first century audience, very important in understanding Revelation, not just because of the timing, but also in terms of how they would understand it. We should be thinking about what they would be thinking about. And some of the things like the 666 are, and the harlot, the prostitute riding on the beast, which also she sits on 7 hills. Those things become much easier to interpret or much more definitively interpreted, I should say, when we think about what it would mean to its original audience. But in addition to that, I'm going to say that we will see that in some cases, multiple cases in Revelation, it's actually about them. It's telling their story. It's showing them where they are in this great cosmic struggle and unfolding of events, some of which would be very confusing to them or difficult. We cover that in the Revelation document. It'll be a separate deep dive video, but kind of the apostolic witness, the rest of the New Testament, that we sort of don't think about it, we just read over it a little bit. But when you piece it together, you go, oh, some of these things were very poignant, significant things during that time in terms of questions that the churches had that they were asking. And Paul, some of the New Testament letters are written to address that, and some of the parts of the letters address some of these questions that they had that had to do with where they were in the sequence of events. When will the end come? The disciples asked Jesus this, so it's also in the Gospels. So it's very much about the folks that were during this transition period and this period of overlap where the new has begun, but the old hasn't yet been totally done away with. And there's some significant events happening. And Revelation is largely about that, which in ways means that it's about the people that were living during that time. So it is not just written to them, it's also largely about them. And then finally, key number 7, there is a verse, it's later in chapter 19, but I think relevant for the whole book, not just relevant for that chapter and the vision that's being seen there when this verse pops up. But it says the testimony, or the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. And so what does that mean? I think it's a hermeneutical key, not just a random verse kind of placed there in chapter 19, which is that prophecy, which Revelation has a bunch of prophecies, right? Visions, that the spirit of those things is the testimony of Jesus. They are about Jesus. That's the point. So we wouldn't be surprised then if every vision testifies to Jesus, to his cross and its effects as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and a lot of forward looking that now has been fulfilled and has a lot of significant covenantal and cosmic, if you will, ramifications and effects. And Revelation is going to show us the cross and its effects from multiple vantage points. That makes sense because the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. The spirit of prophecy isn't to predict newspaper headlines for the distant future or the end of the physical universe. That's not what the spirit of prophecy is from a New Testament perspective. And so it's relevant and important to keep that in mind as we read through Revelation, that Revelation itself is the book that gave us this particular statement, that the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. Okay, what does that mean? Testimony of Jesus is two-sided consequence. It is preservation for those in the new covenant, particularly in Revelation. Preservation is going to be seen. And it's desolation for those who clung to the old. So it's that two-sided scroll. There's the positive aspects of the old, even like in the old covenant with Moses. There was the, hey, do all these right things, you get all these blessings. Do the wrong things, here's all the curses that are going to be brought on you, and it'll be terrible. And so similarly in Revelation, we see sort of that duality, but with old and new. That cling to the old, here comes the judgment, bowls of wrath. Be a part of the new, be in Christ, then here's all the things that are a part of that path. And so those are the dual sides of the scroll. So when we're in Revelation, it's helpful to ask, how does this display the cross? If you're reading one of the visions, where is the cross on display? Where is Jesus' work being displayed, or the effects of the cross? And then, as we mentioned in the section, the key for the structural perspective, look at that structural table, understand where you are, and that will also help influence or guide your interpretation of a particular passage or a particular image, because you understand where you are in the big scheme of the structure of Revelation, and then specifically think about how is this thing displaying the cross or its effects. So the covenant transition that it accomplished, will give you a lot of clarity and help you sort of get your bearings. If your reading makes a cycle about something else, other than the cross and its effects, I will suggest that you probably misread it and are probably misunderstanding it. So you want to go back to the beginning, read it again, keeping these keys in mind, and see where that has you land. So in summary, we got these keys. Time signatures, they're Daniel's. That's going to be helpful. We see that it recapitulates, but there's also a forward arc, forward movement throughout the whole book while recapitulating. There's a structural, I won't say symmetry, that implies some kind of midpoint, and it's the same on both sides, but there's a structure to it, and that's helpful to see where we are. Are we in the seals? Generally, it's about covenant and authorization, inauguration, purchasing, right? So that deed or contract. When we're in trumpets, we're in proclamation. So we need to think about that, and you'll see that will help influence and support our interpretation of the different visions. To Israel's coming on the clouds means judgment, not physical coming. First century audience, very important to remember that and try to think as best we can from their perspective and how they would interpret some of these things. And then finally, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So if we're not thinking about Jesus and his work, if we're thinking that it's about something else, news headlines, we are off on the wrong path. All right, that's it. Hope you enjoy the ensuing videos. Dive into the rest of the core videos, and I hope this is helpful in setting the stage for that and providing some framework, some guidance in interpreting different parts of Revelation, understanding where you are in the book, and some key things, particularly a few of them that are particularly troublesome for us as modern Western Christians. So that's it.